Okay, we are recording. So let me get my notes. Well, I want to welcome everybody to the third session. All of those, welcome back to those who were here last week. And we do have some people for whom this is their first week, and welcome to you also. We hope that the new folks have been able to review the past two classes. The week's topic is Public Policy and the Civil Rights Movement. And I'm going to turn it over to Sue.
Thank you, Bob. Can everybody hear me? Thumbs up, maybe?
Yes, yes.
Okay, very good. All right. So sorry it took so long for us to get started. Perseverance, let's see, that was the rover on Mars, right? So it's like it's a good term for these days. And I am so grateful for the opportunity to share this time for you as together we explore racism in America, the history we didn't learn in school. Today, we focus on part 3 of 6, 20th century public policy and the civil rights movement. This marks a period when racism in society and public policy spread beyond the South, in part because of population shifts like the Great Migration, and in part because of the outsized influence of Southern politicians on federal policy. All of this was undergirded by our country's perpetuation of the myth of racial inferiority. As I said in my candid comment, other countries have been involved in a process called Truth and Reconciliation, and America is in desperate need of such a process. So our focus here is embarking on more truth. Much of it is painful, as we have already seen, incomprehensible even, especially for those of us who believe that we are good people who seek justice and truth. Much of this history isn't just history, but is alive and pervasive in our society today. I believe that in bringing to light this aspect of America's past that we should have known but didn't, and seeing its impact on our country even today, we may develop a new or renewed urgency to act, to finally and truly address these profound inequities. So we'll begin with a brief recap from last week, where we saw the impact of the unchecked power of white supremacy in the South, even after the war came to an end. The Reconstruction violence, that graphic that showed the progress of those lynchings across the various states, because loss in the war even intensified the desire or the drive of white people to continue to subjugate the African Americans. We saw the insidious application of the 13th Amendment via the Black codes that led to widespread convict leasing in the South with all of its consequences. And we talked about one of the Supreme Court's significant decisions, and there will be others, Plessy v. Ferguson, that made separate but equal the law of the land, and embarked on a slew of legislation that made segregation a punitive act via the Jim Crow laws. The terror spectacle lynchings are horrific, and to this day, we still do not have a federal law that declares lynching illegal. And finally, the Great Migration, where 6 million African Americans between the period of 1916 and 1970 left the South and moved to cities in the East and North and West. And throughout all of this time period, there was a significant emphasis on the continued disenfranchisement of Black voters, which is surely being replicated today. So now we move to the mid-20th century and look at public policy in a number of areas: in housing, Social Security, the GI Bill, education, and the interstate highway system. And the public policy in these areas further cemented racial discrimination in our country. And then we will turn our attention to pivotal events and the impact of the civil rights movement. So first, we look at housing segregation. Until 1917, cities across the country mandated the areas where Blacks could live. You can live here, you cannot live there. And virtually every city had the ability to determine that level, that degree of segregation. But in 1917, there was a Supreme Court decision, Buchanan v. Worley, that came out of Louisville, Kentucky, that declared that cities mandating those segregated areas violated the 14th Amendment and was unconstitutional. So the cities couldn't mandate it, but the cities transitioned to something known as racially restricted deed covenants. And these were clauses in property deeds that declared that a particular property could only be sold to another white person. And that continued until it was challenged in 1926. And the Supreme Court, in a case known as Corrigan v. Buckley, looked at this and said, well, they're okay. And that's reminiscent of a previous Supreme Court decision that said really the 14th Amendment only applied to actions by the government, not by private individuals. And so since these racially restricted deed covenants were managed and adhered to by private parties, the Supreme Court said, go for it. So by 1940, 80% of the property deeds in Chicago and Los Angeles and 85% of the properties in Detroit carried these racially restricted deed covenants. And in 1948, the Supreme Court once again reaffirmed their voluntary usage, that that's okay. And so these covenants were not ultimately outlawed until the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So for 50 years, these restrictions on where Blacks could live, and again, this is not the South that we're talking about anymore. This is across the country. These are federal laws. In the midst of all of this, following the Great Depression, as the economy began to recover, it became clear that there was a terrible homeownership crisis in the country. New houses were not being built, people couldn't afford to buy them, and it was impacting all sorts of industries associated with housing. At the time, if you wanted to get a home loan, you had to make a sizable down payment, and the repayment period was generally 10 years. And so Congress sought to open up the housing markets by passing the National Housing Act of 1934. But at the same time, an entity known as the Homeowner Loan Corporation set out to create residential security maps in 239 cities across the country. The security had nothing to do with physical security, but only to do with financial security. What was the likelihood that if a mortgage were issued to a homeowner in various parts of these cities, what's the likelihood that the mortgage would be repaid? But the interesting aspect of that was that the security had nothing to do with the financial capability of someone to repay a mortgage, but only with other characteristics, other demographics of the residents. And so here's an example of one of the 239 residential security maps. This one is from Atlanta. And the map was coded into 4 colors: green, blue, yellow, and red. Green was the best. That was the place where you could be assured that a mortgage was going to be repaid due to some assessment of the homeowner's potential. Blue was called still desirable. It was fading a little bit in terms of the residents, but Mortgages in blue areas were still desirable to issue those. And remember, the FHA did not issue mortgages, it insured the mortgages that the banks issued. And so the importance of this was that banks could take the risk of making a mortgage and believe that if the mortgagee were to default, that the FHA would cover their losses. Yellow was categorized as definitely declining, and red was categorized as hazardous. Again, that had nothing to do with the physical surroundings or environment of these properties. Instead, the terms that were used to define particularly yellow and red areas were words like infiltration, populations that were subversive, undesirable, inharmonious, lower grade. And so if you take a look at the underwriter's manual for the FHA, you see provisions that guided the underwriter's action in determining whether the FHA would insure a mortgage or not. For example, deed restrictions are apt to prove more effective than a zoning ordinance in providing protection from adverse influences. Where the same deed restrictions apply over a broad area, and where these restrictions relate to racial occupancy, a favorable condition is apt to exist. The valuator should investigate areas surrounding the location, the house being looked at, to determine whether or not incompatible racial and social groups are present, to the end that an intelligent prediction may be made regarding the possibility or probability of the location being invaded by such groups. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy generally leads to instability and a reduction in values. The social class of the parents of children at the school will in many instances have a vital bearing. Schools should be appropriate to the needs of the new community, and they should not be attended in large numbers by inharmonious racial groups. Recorded deed restrictions should strengthen and supplement zoning ordinances, and to be really effective should include 9 provisions noted below, one of which is prohibition of the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they were intended. And as a consequence, less than 5% of FHA mortgages were granted to people who were not white. And even more significant, these same racial provisions in the underwriting manual for the FHA were incorporated and adopted by the Veterans Administration in determining who should get mortgage loans through the GI Bill. So what is a person to do? You are a financially secure, stable, African-American family, and you want to buy a house, but you can't afford the high down payment, 10-year repayment that's offered by standard mortgages at the time. So you turn to something called contracts for deed. This was an arrangement offered by speculators who bought properties expressly for this purpose. It required a down payment and regular monthly installments from the occupant, but that's where the similarity to a mortgage ended. The sale price and effective interest rate tended to be wildly inflated. The buyer assumed all the responsibilities of the homeowner, needing to make repairs, pay taxes, but the seller kept the title. And so there was no equity that the buyer had in the property until the contract for deed was paid in full. And invariably, if you missed a payment, the contract was voided and you lost everything that you had paid. If you satisfied the full term of the contract at the end, you would often be presented with an unexpected multi-thousand-dollar insurance bill that had to be paid, or again, the contract was voided. And because of the terms and the financial impact, along with the lack of equity to borrow against, meant most families didn't have the wherewithal to invest in keeping the property up in terms of its physical, its look and its physical effectiveness. And what would happen is that these contract for deed companies would go into the blue areas or the yellow areas. Often they would hire a Black woman to push a baby carriage up and down the streets. And then behind her would come agents who would knock on the doors and say, you know, they're coming. And you don't want to be the last person on your block to sell your house, because you know what would happen to its value if that were to occur, occurred for you. And so they purchased these properties at below market value, sold them to prospective Black home buyers at inflated values and at inflated interest rates. And this process, this practice, this economic instrument continued until it was outlawed by the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So for 50 years, many potential Black homeowners were locked out of the market by lack of access to FHA mortgages. And in fact, even though it was outlawed in 1968, redlining practices are still going on. Settlements are still underway. In 2015, HCSB had to pay a $33 million fine for continuing redlining practices in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And if we look at what happened in the early 2000s with the subprime mortgages, it was the same fundamental practice being applied, and a disproportionate number of those subprime mortgages were offered to potential Black homeowners. So out of all of this activity to ensure housing segregation, what were the consequences? The housing policy itself led to housing segregation, which led to educational segregation. And on all those areas where education funding is tied to property taxes, the consequences of these contracts for deed, the inability to keep your house up, the deterioration in home prices and property taxes affected education equality, which of course led to discrimination in terms of employment opportunity, the economic impact that created, and also the environmental and the health impact. And as a consequence, if we look at the ratio of wealth between Black and white families in America today, the wealth ratio is 5% for Black families on average, to 100% for white families, and the income ratio is 60%. In fact, in the period from 1984 to 2009, the racial wealth gap tripled in the United States. And today, on average, 41% of Black families own homes versus 73% of white families. Other public programs that were implemented during this time period, the Social Security Act of 1935, Title II, which many of us are familiar with, the old age, that's not a really good term anyway, the old age survivors and disability insurance. It did not apply to domestic and farm workers, and 65% of African Americans worked in those occupations. You'll recall in the period after the Civil War, the formerly enslaved could only work as farmers or domestics unless they paid an exorbitant sum for a license to follow some other occupation. And so that proportion of African American citizens could not participate in Social Security. Now, some changes were made to the Act in 1950 and 1954 that began to expand its application. But the history of not being able to participate in Social Security has had a profound effect on a sizable part of the population. In addition to Title II, other programs that were beneficial to Americans were handled as block grants to states for local administration. And so where those block grants were given particularly to Southern states, the discrimination in terms of those citizens who were able to benefit from those programs was significant as it was implemented in a discriminatory fashion to whites and Blacks in the states, and not just in the South, predominantly in the South, but not only. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, known as the GI Bill, was assessed to be the most race-neutral benefit program ever passed by Congress. And it provided for mortgage and other loans for veterans and for education benefits. But the implementation of the GI Bill also resulted in discrimination in housing, in education. It intensified segregation and had huge economic consequences because a clause that was added to the GI Bill just before its passage to ensure that Southern representatives and senators would sign on indicated that the GI Bill would be implemented on a local basis with no federal oversight or implementation. And so when GIs, veterans began applying for the benefits, they were turned down for housing loans because the VA adopted the same policies as the FHA in terms of adverse influences and inharmonious racial groups in granting mortgages. And so a much smaller fraction of Black veterans were able to get GI Bill home loans. In terms of education, white veterans were steered toward or assisted in applying to colleges, but Black veterans were steered to vocational programs. Now, in part, this was because there weren't enough places where Black veterans could go to college. The HBSC, the historically Black colleges and universities, had limitations just physically in terms of how many new students they could admit out of the flock of veterans that were returning after World War II. And Northern colleges and universities at that time had quotas for the number of Black students that they would admit, and Southern colleges and universities wouldn't admit any Black students at all. And so the potential and the opportunity for a college education was dramatically impaired, even given the opportunities that were thought to be afforded by the GI Bill. And further, when these Black veterans went to the vocational schools, there were numerous instances where the equipment and the materials to teach the vocation were reserved for use by the white students and not available for the Black veteran students who attended. And so it intensified the segregation and did not afford the economic opportunity to Black veterans that had been the hope of the program. And once again, we see racial violence rear its head. On the evening of February 12th, 1946, Isaac Woodard, a 26-year-old Black Army veteran, boarded a bus in Augusta, Georgia. Earlier that day, he had been honorably discharged from the Army, and he was heading to Winnsboro, South Carolina to reunite with his wife. The bus driver made a stop en route, and Woodard asked if he had time to use the bathroom. And the driver cursed at him, and apparently Woodard responded. And later in his deposition, he admitted that he had cursed back. But neither man said anything more until the bus stopped in Batesburg, South Carolina. And there, the driver told local police about Woodard's impudence. He was ordered off the bus. When he tried to give his story of what had happened, a police officer struck him with a nightstick. He was escorted to the jail, where he testified he was repeatedly beaten by Police Chief Linwood Scholl. Woodard said that Scholl pounded him in his eyes with the end of the nightstick until he blacked out. When he regained consciousness, he couldn't see. He was charged with disorderly conduct because the police testified that he had been intoxicated. Witnesses said he had not been drinking. He was required to pay a fine, and then he was driven to a veterans hospital in Columbia, where doctors told him that he would be permanently blind. There were attempts to prosecute Linwood Scholl, but all resulted in either no charges or no convictions. And so the lynchings continued. And there were multiple cases of lynchings of Black men in uniform, as we discussed last week, simply for the crime of being a Black man in a United States military uniform. And so now we turn our attention to school desegregation in America. The Plessy v. Ferguson decision for separate but equal in 1896 was adopted by virtually every education system in the United States. And of course, it was predicated on underlying assumptions about Black inferiority and inability. So in Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Mississippi, almost 5 million African Americans, more than half of them, had less than 5 years of education. In South Carolina and Louisiana, 60% had no more than a 4th grade education. And so in the case that became known as Brown v. Board of Education, 5 entities combined and filed suit with the Supreme Court in 1952. But it took until 1954 for a decision to be handed down, because at the time the suit was filed, Fred Vinson was the Chief Justice and he passed away. And so Eisenhower named former California Governor Earl Warren to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And after that nomination and appointment occurred, Eisenhower hosted a dinner party to explain to Chief Justice Warren that Southerners, quote, are not bad people. All they are concerned about is to see that their sweet little girls are not required to sit in school alongside big, overgrown Negroes. Subsequent to the Brown v. Board of Education decision, Eisenhower opined that naming Earl Warren as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was the worst decision that he had ever made. But the decision was made that Brown v. Board of Ed, that school desegregation was unconstitutional in violation of the 14th Amendment. And the resistance was massive. Blacks were barred from public schools as early as 1821 in Delaware. And by 1910, Black citizens had tried building small schools on their own, but basically they had no electricity, plumbing, or desks. And by 1950, just 4 years before the Brown v. Board of Education decision, there was only one high school in the entire state of Delaware that Blacks could attend. It was Howard High School in Wilmington. And if you lived in the far reaches of Newcastle County, let alone Kent or Sussex County, unless you had a friend or a family member that you could go and live with, you could not go to high school. And so at that time, the average education of Black youth and adults was 7.2 years. And so when we think about stereotypes of education levels and intelligence of African Americans, education level certainly plays into the creation, the formation, and the perpetuation of the stereotypes. The resistance in the South was massive. As I'd indicated, Delaware resisted strongly. The District Court for Delaware authorized a 12-year delay in implementation of the desegregation order. Prince Edward County in Virginia closed all of its public schools from 1959 to 1964. No one could go to a public school in that county for that 5-year period. Now, Southern white segregationists did send money to fund white private schools where select students could attend, but the damage to the entire population was huge for that 5 years. Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and South Carolina ruled that the federal courts had no jurisdiction. They were not covered by those laws. And Georgia voted to repeal the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and impeach the Supreme Court. And so the Southern Manifesto was developed, and its entire purpose was to stall and defy. In fact, to this day, Alabama's state constitution mandates segregated schools. There were referenda in 2004 and 2012 to remove that clause from the state constitution, and the referendum failed both times. So it is still in the Alabama Constitution. And so we saw some of the resistance within the African American community. The Little Rock Nine attempted to desegregate Central High School in Arkansas in 1957. But after a short period of time, the Black students withdrew, given the hatred and the potential violence that was directed against them. But in New Orleans, Little Ruby Bridges attempted to desegregate the William Frantz Elementary School. There were 6 families who had first graders, prospective first graders, who agreed that their students would go to the William Frantz Elementary School in order to desegregate it. But the night before school was to start, Ruby's parents got a phone call from the organizers saying that the other 5 parents had changed their minds and their children would not be going to school with Ruby. Every white teacher in William Frantz School refused to have Ruby in their class. Every white parent said they would not send their students to that school if they had to be in a classroom with Ruby. But there was one teacher, Barbara Henry, who came from Boston, Massachusetts, and she agreed to teach Ruby. But because no other white parent would let any of their children be in a class with Ruby, Barbara Henry and Ruby Bridges were the first grade class that year. The local grocery store banned her parents from being able to shop there. Her father was fired from his job, and her grandparents were evicted from their tenant farm. But still she went, and she completed the school year. And in the intervening years has become a significant civil rights activist. Bob and I heard her speak at Smith College a few years ago, and she is an incredible person with incredible stories to tell. And she has written a book about her experiences and her relationship as it developed with the federal marshals who escorted her to school. 4 federal marshals escorted little Ruby Bridges to school every day to keep her from being physically harmed. And Norman Rockwell commemorated her experience in a notable work of art. Among the consequences continue today in terms of educational performance and capability. In 2021, the 10 states with the lowest level of education include Texas, South Carolina, Kentucky, Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and West Virginia, all a legacy of horrific decisions being made in the perceived zero-sum game that if an African American gets a benefit, it somehow takes something away from the white students. I'm only briefly going to mention the interstate highway system. There was a whole hour class on this, but the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 authorized the largest public works program in US history, authorizing construction of 41,000 miles of interstate highways that spanned the nation. And it authorized $26 billion to cover 90% of the cost of construction. And today, the cost of maintaining that network of roads is $106 billion a year. During the initial construction period, more than 475,000 families, more than 1 million people were displaced from their homes, their property seized by eminent domain, and the vast majority of those affected were low-income people of color in urban core areas. Term often used to describe these projects was white roads through black bedrooms. It fractured communities. Certainly in Wilmington, Delaware, you can see the impact of that. And it caused significant economic and environmental justice issues as well, because the exhaust and the traffic, the lack of green space in these core city areas has health implications and consequences for the residents. And when coupled with the inability of Black families to move out of cities into the suburbs by access to meaningful mortgages and the impact of the housing segregation, of the housing security maps, the burden borne by Black residents today in big city areas is huge. And there are stories to be told about virtually every city through which the interstate highway system runs. But in Wilmington, the choice of location, of pathway, was between current day 95 and the, I never can remember, I guess it's 495 that goes around the city. The choice to go through the city of Wilmington, split the residential area in two and all of its associated implications was a decision made by a lame duck city council by a vote of one person that resulted in that decision that probably could have been reversed, but never was. So now we look at the pivotal civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. And here are some of the images from that time period. Interestingly, between the period of 1950 and 1975, 150 new Confederate monuments were erected in cities around the country. I guess there was a new appreciation of the Confederate soldiers and the lost cause that happened to coincide with the civil rights movement. But one of the telling aspects was that law enforcement agencies aligned themselves with the white power structure, and they became the face of violent resistance to integration. So whether it was the dogs or the fire hoses or the billy clubs or the horses, the role of the police in preventing integration and preventing the civil rights movement shapes today's relationship between the police forces and communities of color. Just like today, cell phone images have had a profound effect. When you see images like this, it's not the same as hearing the words. And so one of the pivotal events in accelerating the civil rights movement in the United States was the murder of Emmett Till. It was August of 1955, and Emmett, who lived in Chicago, was visiting his family relatives in Money, Mississippi. He was 14 and his mother had let him go there for the summer to get out of the city and enjoy time with his family. Well, he and his cousins went to the local Bryant General Store and something happened. It's reminiscent of the situation with Dick Rowland and the elevator in the Drexel building in Tulsa. But something happened. he was a cheeky little kid. He might have whistled, he might have said something, but it was determined that whatever it was horrifically inappropriate to Carolyn Bryant, the owner of the store. And when her husband, Roy Bryant, returned home 4 nights later, he and his brother-in-law, J.W. Milan, appeared at Emmett's uncle's home and demanded that Emmett be handed over to them. And he was. And no one knew what had happened to Emmett until several days later, when his body surfaced in the Tallahatchie River, where a cotton gin fan blade had been tied around his neck with barbed wire, presumably thinking that it would never surface. His mother, Mamie Till, who had his body brought back to Chicago, refused the advice that she received from virtually everyone that there be a closed casket. And she said, I want the world to see what this hatred has done to my beautiful boy. And so it was an open casket funeral, and Jet Magazine published the image of Emmett Till for everyone to see. If you go to the African American History Museum in Washington, D.C., there is a section of the museum devoted to Emmett's story, because it was an enormous catalyst. People could no longer look away. And so that began the process. It was followed by the Montgomery bus boycott that went on for a year. 99% of the Black citizens joined the boycott, even though that was their way to get to work. They banded together, they hired taxis, they gave rides to one another. And after a year, because of a parallel case known as Browder v. Gale, the Supreme Court ruled that the back of the bus segregation on buses was unconstitutional. In 1960, there was the Greensboro lunch counter boycott, where well-dressed, well-behaved African-American youth and young adults went and sat at the Greensboro, North Carolina lunch counter asking to be served. And as this 6-month protest went on, they were doused with ketchup and milk and coffee and mustard. They were dragged off the stools, they were kicked and beaten. But ultimately, the lunch counters were desegregated in July of that year. In 1961, the Freedom Rides began. These were typically college students and young adults from the North who were riding interstate buses from north to south to ensure that the prohibition against segregation in buses and bus terminals was being honored. But there was a great deal of violence that accompanied these freedom rides. One of the first ones stopped on May 14th in Anniston, Alabama, where outraged local whites shot out the tires of the bus and then threw a gasoline bomb into the back of the bus. As the riders struggled to escape through the front door, they were set upon and beaten. And there's an amazing story that Oprah Winfrey has highlighted. There's a YouTube video available where she brought the Freedom Riders back together to talk about their experiences. And then she brought in a young woman, well, not so young anymore. She had been a young girl in Anniston, Alabama, when the bombing and the beatings happened. And she had taken it upon herself to go around to all of those who were injured, to give them water and bandages and try to help them. So glimmers of hope and help, even in the midst of all that hatred. In 1963 was the March on Washington, and Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech, but he was talking about much more than a dream at that march. He was talking about economic equality and jobs. And it was not just the nonviolent vision that we have of Martin Luther King, but his demand that Blacks be given economic opportunity in this country. If we had time, I have a March on Washington story, but maybe there'll be another opportunity to tell you that at a later point. That same year, on September 15th, at 10:22 in the morning, at the 16th Street Baptist Church, children were preparing for Youth Day, when suddenly the 19 sticks of dynamite that 4 Ku Klux Klan members had planted under the stairwell were detonated, and 4 little girls were killed. Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, Cynthia Wesley, and Denise McNair died that day. And Addie Mae's cousin, Sarah Collins, was blinded in the explosion. There were 4 Ku Klux Klan members who asserted that they had done it, but that were not brought to trial. The first of them was brought to trial in 1977, 14 years later, and 2 more were brought to trial in 2001 and 2002, and the 4th man was never brought to trial. And I believe only one of them was ultimately convicted. And so as time went on, in 1964, Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner were 3 civil rights activists who were stopped by police for a traffic violation, and the police murdered them and buried their bodies in a shallow grave nearby that was uncovered, but again, no consequences to those who killed them. And that year, the Civil Rights Act was passed by Congress. In 1965, the Selma to Montgomery Voting Rights March took place. I think we've all seen the images of John Lewis and that group being set upon by police on horseback with batons and being beaten. And that year, the Voting Rights Act was passed. And then sort of bringing this period to a horrific close in 1968 with the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. So despite all that has happened since then, this was a period of time, a ray of hope, similar to Reconstruction, but with longer lasting impact, where we have the opportunity to build on the progress made and the actions taken. But once again, resistance has been massive and much more work needs to be done.
So you're finished. Thank you, Sue. And I would like to ask anybody who has a comment or a question, there is a button at the bottom of the computer screens. I'm not sure about phones, but at the bottom of the computer screens, there should be a button called reactions. Amongst those reactions is a symbol with a thumb up. And what happens if you press that symbol is that your image goes to the front of the list so I can see it, because I can't see everybody on one screen. So if you want to talk, please push that button so I can recognize you, and then I will call on you and you can take your system off of mute and ask your question or make your comment. So we're now open for questions and comments. Carol Leach. You'll need to unmute. That should be on the left side bottom of your screen.
Got it. I guess it's just, all of this is just so painful that it just seems like it's not getting any better. I probably shouldn't even be commenting, but it's just so difficult to hear this when you have legislation and then the Supreme Court or the, you know, implementation just goes so awry that it's just very distressing. And I know we haven't even gotten to the current situation, and you know, now that we're even decades beyond the civil rights and the desegregation laws and everything, and we still see what's happening today. um, I it's hard to understand what we can do to make this right.
It's clear that what we're seeing today is a direct legacy from the past. I do believe that part of the reason it has been perpetuated is because there's so much of this that people of good faith, if I might say, or people of meaningful intent that we didn't realize, that we didn't know how intentional, how purposeful, how it, once you know that, it becomes clear that there are multiple things that need to happen. Certainly, people's attitudes and beliefs need to change, and legislation needs to be implemented to help make that happen. But once you know all the things that have happened in the past, I do think it gives us a perspective to say, well, perhaps these are some things that are different that should happen in the future. I mean,
I know now we're trying to get this new voting rights legislation through, which obviously is absolutely necessary, since the Supreme Court apparently not very long ago decided that it was okay for the states to, you know, go back to doing whatever they wanted to do and didn't need any oversight. But it's also very hard to see how in this divided Congress that we have, that there's any way that we're really going to get any voting rights legislation, even though it's obviously extremely important.
And you can only, and I agree, absolutely. You can only hope that with a different level of understanding or appreciation of the damage being done, that a mind or two might be swayed, you know. It's a huge uphill climb, but it's difficult. You know, you sort of have to ask anyone, particularly anyone in a position of power in Congress or the executive branch or the judiciary, what should be the role of government in a democracy when it comes to voting? Is the role of government to facilitate voting or to constrain voting? And who would say the role of government is to constrain voting? I mean, for those who are interested in even considering the philosophical question about it, I think in part for people who believe that all this has just been random and, you know, individual actions without intent, to appreciate the intent and to see what's been done, and to understand that it requires something different moving forward. It's a perilous time. It is a very perilous time. We're going to talk in detail about the Supreme Court decision in Shelby County v. Holder in 2013 that resulted in the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, and what happened as a consequence then and what is happening now. Again, as a better way of understanding that this is not coincidental. This is not random. This is purposeful. This is intentional. And it's important that white people, who by definition in our country hold more of a position of power or responsibility or effectiveness, ally ourselves with people who are bearing the brunt of these horrific decisions and these horrific actions, and to find ways to speak up, and to hopefully have some influence. I mean, things have happened that people didn't expect. The senatorial elections in Georgia were not what anybody expected. They were different, but it requires people speaking, acting, contributing, getting engaged, getting involved, making our voices heard, or it won't change.
I saw briefly a hand up from Beth Hyde.
This is actually her husband, Fritz.
Fritz, okay, from you.
Sue, you actually just mentioned one of the things I was going to say was it's important to celebrate the victories and triumphs because there's a lot that's still got to change. But what happened in Georgia was not expected to happen. Within the last 5 years, we've had a Black president. I mean, who would have thought that, even 30 years ago? But along the lines, you don't want to say that it's all good and everything's fixed. We're a long ways from that. But it's also important to celebrate the victories because that gives you confidence and faith and energy to keep trying to change things. And then I wanted to thank you very, very much because the beginning to knowledge is understanding. And thank you very much for today's presentation and the ones before. And I look forward to the ones in the future.
Thank you, Fritz. And you're exactly right. Celebrating the accomplishments builds our hope. And that is important because it can get really dark. And you can imagine if it gets dark for us, who are those of us who are white here, who are in that privileged group, imagine what it is like for those who are the recipients of all of this discrimination. So I keep telling myself, well, no matter how tired I get, it hardly measures up, Rebecca?
Two comments. The college that I went to was in Prince Edward County. And speaking of progress, we were not allowed to walk on certain sides of the street because that was near where the African Americans lived. So it was a very, very different time. And now there are many, many Blacks who attend this university. So, when I get the alumni magazines, it's just like two different worlds. What I experienced in this all-white college, where we were not allowed to go into the town except on a certain time when they sort of made sure that, we would be safe. And so anyway, progress has been made. And the other comment that I wanted to make is that my first year of teaching, I taught in a school. It was their first year to desegregate. And I had, this was in a high school, and I was the teacher that was given the African-American boy who decided to attend. And it was I was given absolutely no training whatsoever. And it was a very frightening time because the parents were, as I drove to school that morning, lining the sides of the road, yelling, screaming, posters, guns. And they were, convinced that they were not going to allow their children to come in the class with this boy. And so he came in the room and nobody else came in. And eventually the bell rang and they decided to come in against their parents. It was a campus style school where each classroom opened directly to the outside. So the parents could come right up to my door, to the windows. And they were yelling and screaming and banging on the windows and saying all kinds of terrible things. And eventually the kids came in and they pulled every desk in the room away from this boy all along the sides of the room. And no one, of course, would sit near him or hand any of the materials to him. The good news about it is he was an incredible kid. And I survived getting through that as a young teacher, having no training, my first day of school, first day teaching. And he was a freshman in high school, but by his senior year, he was president of his class. So
Where
There
was that, Rebecca?
Excuse me,
Where was it?
Farmville, Virginia.
I didn't know that about you, Rebecca. Thank you.
Beverly.
I just wonder, when you see and you remember those scenes of the policemen setting the dogs on Black people and fire hoses and all that kind of stuff, I just wonder how many African Americans now are police in the South and whether that has made any impact on, and you can see the history of policing and the whole thing about suppression of African American people. So I just wondered if having Black policemen has made any difference, or how many Black policemen there are in the South. I don't know.
I have a response to that. Martin, I don't know, would you like to respond to that question? No? I don't know what the numbers are. And there's been so much being said here lately as we've become aware of the degree to which police forces, well, actually, we're going to do a whole class on it. The 5th class is the war on drugs, mass incarceration, the relationship between police forces and communities of color. There's no short answer to the question, but I'll say a couple things. There are 2 views of police forces. One is as warriors and one is as guardians.
Yeah.
And if you consider that the motto of most police departments is protect and serve, you would assume that their model would be the guardian model. But it is not. It's the warrior model. And there are our allies and there are enemies. And as we are seeing, I believe, through the progress of our history, certainly from the beginning in the South, where police chiefs and mayors and governors were spectators at lynchings, and certainly in the North, as we see even now, with murder after murder of unarmed Black, usually man, with no consequences. This is not a case of a few bad apples. And this is not a case of a few Black cops will change the culture in a police force. Perhaps they're the token, perhaps they're the window dressing, perhaps they're the police that someone could point to and say, see, it's like, well, I'm not prejudiced, I have a Black friend. Well, our police force is even-handed because look, we have 3 Black police officers. It doesn't fundamentally change anything, is my view. And we'll talk more about that whole criminal justice system and the police and the militarization of the police. For those of you who live in the Wilmington area in Delaware, there is something called the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights that provides extraordinary protection for police officers, and the legislature has established a task force to try to address it, and they're not making any progress. The entrenched position and values and the history are huge. Delaware is fortunate to have, I believe, a very well-intentioned attorney general, but she's up against a lot of forces that keep us from making much progress. But I believe we will, but it's a slog.
It was interesting too, in the Capitol insurrection, some of the Black policemen said they were called the N-word multiple times. And, these people are all for the police.
Yeah,
So
they're
get this
carrying.
situation like that. And then, of course, Now they're not for the police. It's very complicated.
Well, yes, they're carrying Blue Lives Matter signs as they're beating up the police. I don't think that has, yeah, anyway, that's another whole thing.
Do I
Bob,
have,
are you calling on people or do you want me
Yeah.
to, or?
I am. Martin and Michelle, you had your hand up next. And
Oh, Michelle, I can't hear you.
there's no volume, no voice. And you're not muted.
Okay, I had this problem the other day in one of these. If you can go out and come back in, we will be able to hear you. And as soon as you're back in, we'll hand you the microphone. How about that? Bob?
I'm waiting for them to get back in. I don't see them. Not yet.
It'll take a minute. Why don't you call on somebody else and then as soon as.
George.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Susan, that this is very complicated. I worked shore patrol in the Navy and got to see some of my sailors beat up by British police officers. And when Rodney King happened 30 years ago, I'd say, well, now, see, that's what happens. That's what it is. We got a chance to see it, but it doesn't seem like we responded very well. And as somebody that thought of himself as a warrior, and you talked about, oh, well, see, you can be a warrior or you can be somebody that takes care of people. Well, I've been doing work in our local community about this, and we actually have a group of people that are working with the New Garden Township, the new Southern Chester County Police Force, and talk to them about what the issues they are and stuff and get them out. But one of the things that the police chief said was he felt there were three kinds of people in this world. He thought there were sheep, there were wolves, and there were sheepdogs. And he thought of himself as the sheepdog that was protecting the sheep from the wolves. Well, the problem with that is the police are also responsible for protecting the wolves. I mean, we tend to categorize people and say they're this kind of person or that kind of person and whatever. And it really hit home to me as the census supervisor for Kennett Square. I had we worked through the pandemic, and it was very, very difficult for us because people were putting their lives on the line just trying to count everybody. And we had one of my people who was beaten up by somebody, and it was a big McMansion that happened to it. And I imagine the person that did it was a Trumper, you know, and he just didn't believe in the census, and it was counting people it shouldn't have. And his son came around and beat the daylights out of my 74-year-old enumerator and threw him to the ground. And when I went to the court for prosecution, I found out that the 20-something kid that beat up my guy was black. And it was like, well, why are you beating up somebody that's just trying to count everybody? And so it's not simple. We shouldn't oversimplify these things, that there's all issues that we have, and we have prejudice, and we have to deal with them. But I almost ask, well, why can't we just dislike these people? I mean, if they believe lies, and they're, after Georgia and Arizona, you have 43 states that are trying to reduce the opportunity for people to vote. This is just evil. And, how can we be part of this? And how could we even, associate? I'm starting to sound like Carol. How do we start to associate with people that are trying to make this country worse? And it is very frustrating, but it's not simple.
No, it is not simple. And we will spend some time in our 6th class talking about where do we go from here. Not that there are magic solutions, but we will begin to look at some of those complexities. Now, Bob is going to call on Michelle. Yeah.
hi,
Oh,
when I saw Ruby Bridges, I had a flashback. we used to live in upstate New York. So in our community, it was after my daughter was in 5th grade, I took her out of the school. It was, yeah, we took our daughter out of the public school and put her in a private school after that. So it had to be 6th or 7th grade. I think my son who's 26 now, my daughter's 29. Um, he was in grade school, but believe it or not, I didn't see her speak, but Ruby Bridges was a speaker at the middle school in the community. So I didn't hear her. I don't know. I couldn't go to hear her speak. I don't know if she saw any other Black people. Now, there are a couple other Black people in the community. She may have seen some, but she is still active out there working in communities, trying to bridge this gap, whatever it may be. But we had taken our daughter out of that school at that time. And it's interesting when I told my son, we told our son that we were taking this class, um, of, slavery, what we didn't learn in school. And I said, didn't they integrate it in your school curriculum when you were in school? He just didn't answer me. So apparently they didn't integrate it, but I had Negro history in middle school. I think Martin didn't, but a structure, I had a whole year semester. It was a very intense class that I had. And even with this going on, I remember when my daughter took AP history at Princeton, and we had a family debate at the dinner table called slavery. She was taught that it was economics, and Dad said, "What was the economic reason?" And she said, "There's no reason. It's just economics." It was not taught slavery was the economic basis for it. She would have gotten the answer wrong if she had picked that, but it wouldn't have been on the test anyway. But she was very strong-willed. She said they taught her at Princeton AP history that the reason for slavery was economics, and that was it. That was the total answer. And so I'm listening to this. It's kind of intense, and what's going on. Kind of hard listen and hard experience, like you're saying. But yeah, I remember Ruby Bridges. I wish I had been able to see her. I think it was like 2004, 2003,
Okay.
somewhere around then. I remember the school district bulletin that she was coming to speak. It was a big deal. But by then, we had taken our daughter out of the school.
Yeah, and maybe I should sell what the significance is of that. We've always lived in predominantly white communities. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to benefit from real estate appreciation and all this other stuff. And even my parents were they lived in primarily integrated communities as well. And this was up in Michigan. My father grew up in Sumter Township. My mother grew up in Hamtramck. And they were stellar students and all this other stuff. But I can tell you, people ask, well, what can we do? First thing is when you see someone doing something that you know is inappropriate, then you need to call them out on it. Because the reason why we're pointing this out here was we were in a school district that the town was only 2% African American, okay? And I can tell you my own history with the police. I almost felt like it would have been the best thing for me if I'd have walked into the police station and introduced myself to say, "Hi, I live in your neighborhood now and I own a house here." Because you wouldn't believe the number of times I got stopped on these minor violations that were trivial in nature, and no one else was getting stopped for it. And so once they seen my license, my driver's license, they said, "Oh, well, this is just a warning." Okay. And so I could, I don't want to go into all the cases, but the reason why we had to take our daughter out of the school is, I'm going to be frank with you, some of the educators were just prejudiced. Okay. We had this one assignment. She was in the 5th grade. And so she wrote this beautiful brochure. They were supposed to write up a travel brochure, beautiful travel brochure. It was one of the best there. Do you know that she had gotten points taken off because she didn't put 2 spaces after the period? And we seen others that weren't as nice as hers that didn't have any points taken off. So of course, we complained about it. Then there was this time, the incident that probably broke the camel's back was my daughter would always raise her hand in class and all this kind of stuff, and she was never called on. So what she did was she had done all of her work and done everything that she was supposed to do. And so while class was going on, she pulled out, was it Harry Potter?
Another book.
It was some book.
But you're reading started.
She already, yeah, well, anyway, she started reading a book in class. And the teacher called on her and she said, what's the question? And so when she was given the question, she answered it correctly. And so the teacher was a little bit upset, talking about the problems we were having. So I asked my daughter, I said, why did you do that? And then she said, the teacher ignored me so much, when I would raise my hand, I decided to ignore her. And so, this stuff goes on and, there's, who knows what the reasoning is. I have no idea what's going on. So you're always going to see these incidents. And the problem with the police, I guess I do want to address this. I know you're going to address it later, but it's a cultural issue. Police officers, you could have we've had Black African-American police chiefs, and like up in Rochester, and it still happens.
Yeah.
And so it's a cultural issue. What do I mean by cultural issue? Okay, when you talk to police officers, and we just had one tell us today, the other day, remember we were just talking about that just this morning. This one police officer was saying, I'm not going to, I'm not going to get involved with corruption. I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to keep my nose clean and not talk about it. What's the problem with that? The problem is this, that police officers have this culture. It's as if they were in the military, like you said, warriors. It's us against them. And so what they will do is, if you're not part of the team, then you at least have to be quiet. And Black police officers will tell you that, look, I had this really bad partner and I transferred to another partner. Well, I said, why don't you complain about the partner? Why don't you do something? Well, nothing would happen. Okay, police unions. One of the first things they do is circle the wagons to protect an officer that's doing something inappropriate. Okay, any other profession, you can't do that. Okay, I mean, think about it. If a physician is doing something inappropriate, what would happen? Okay, and so we have, it's a systemic problem that's enculturated. And so I know you're going to get into that next week. And I don't want to bore you guys with everything, but if I were to tell you everything that happened in my life where there was discrimination, and it's so subtle and so pervasive until it's just hard to describe. Even when we were at U of M, we had a professor that discriminated against, the Black students would say, don't take that professor. Yeah. I mean, it just goes on and on and on and on. So the answer is yes, if you see it, call it out.
Yep.
Okay. That is the first most basic thing to do. If you see it happening to an African American, go and talk to him and say, I'm sorry about this. Is there anything I can do for you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so it's little things like that that will make a difference. And making sure that we're vigilant and understand. Because, I could talk about so many things. One other thing I'd like to point out, and this is something that I really appreciated going to U of M. And this is a class that Michelle and I were in. We were in this statistics class. I had transferred from Wayne State to University of Michigan. And I had taken a statistics class there, but I needed like 1 or 2 more credits. And so I took this one. It was in political science, was it? Or I can't remember. Anyway, and so I never forget what the guy did. He was talking, we had actually started talking about affirmative action because a lot of the students felt, well, Black students don't deserve to be there. Okay. I mean, really, that's how some people felt, but it's because of affirmative action. And so what he had done was he had addressed it very plainly. He drew a normal distribution curve. And he said, this is the general population at the University of Michigan. Then he drew another distribution curve and said, this is the distribution of African-American students. And so he drew a line. And so at that time, African-American students were roughly at the 40th percentile, 30th to 40th percentile. But when he drew the line and he showed the areas under the curve, he said, by looking at this diagram, you can see there's a lot more dumb white students than there are dumb Black students. So get over it. So look at your friend that got in that's stupid instead of complaining about some Black guy or Black woman getting into the university. And so, so little things like that are really, you can appreciate. And it really was a boost for me. And so, yeah, anyway, that's
Well,
just.
I think, Martin, one of the points that you make, and I can't see you anymore because your camera's gone on the fritz for
Okay.
all these technical things. But one of the things that I think is important is the willingness to talk about this. I mean, I'm still in groups where somebody will say, well, and then I saw this Black person, like saying the word is somehow just verboten. And so one of the hopes is that as we gather more and more of this information about our history, depressing and demoralizing as it is, we need to focus on the good things that have happened, but we need to be willing to acknowledge the elephant in the room. We need to be able to talk about it. And I think we need to remember that silence implies consent. If somebody says something and there is no pushback, nothing, then kind of the presumption is that everybody agrees. One of the issues that we often have is, well, I wasn't expecting that. I didn't know how to respond. I thought about it afterwards and I came up with 17 things that I could have, should have said. And I had a boss at DuPont who used the phrase out of the heat of battle a lot. And he would say, if there's going to be a problem, if something needs to be done, you need to think about it out of the heat of battle so that you can come up with your plan, your action, know what you're going to do. And when it happens, you're prepared. And it can be as simple as somebody saying something and the response is, I don't agree with that. Or the response is, that's not my experience. Or the response is, I used to think that, but I learned. And so, depending on the circumstance, there are ways to not be silent. A good friend of mine is Bibi Coker. She is a civil rights activist here in Wilmington. She's in her 80s. She's a pistol. And she was in one of these classes with Saints Andrew and Matthew. And her perspective was, those rabid racists, forget about them. They're not worth the breath. They're not worth the breath. Just pay no attention. But we all got around to, well, putting that stake in the ground, saying I don't agree, is worth doing. It's worth that much breath. The breath needs to be expended on people with whom you can actually have a conversation, a rational conversation. If you're dealing with people who don't deal in truth or fact or reality, it's kind of hard to have a meaningful conversation. But there are people that you can begin to nibble at the edges in terms of experiences and conversations. And I think we need to be, speaking for us white people, we need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. We need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. We don't have all the answers. We don't know all the We don't all know all the ins and the outs. And if we're not comfortable with it, well, it's a pretty small price to pay when you come down to it. So just another way of looking at the circumstances and where do we go from here?
We have two more hands up and then we'll come to a close. Doyle, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, I really appreciate all the ideas that are being presented and all the issues. It says to me that once again, it affirms that this is probably one of the most complex issues that we need to deal with. Somebody mentioned earlier what happened at the Capitol. Well, two things happened there that I don't hear anyone talking about directly. And from my perspective, what happened at the Capitol showed us once again the very dark side of religion, and very specifically Christianity. And it also showed us the very dark side of politics. And it doesn't matter whether we're looking at politics from a Democratic perspective or a Republican perspective or an independent perspective. We saw the very dark side of politics. And someone earlier said, we need to celebrate the successes. Well, yeah, I agree with that. No harm in being a little bit optimistic now and then. But I also think that somehow, as often as we can, we need to drill down into the real source of the issue. And I think part of that has to do with religion. Part of it has to do with politics. Part of it has to do with philosophy. And, these are categories that somehow I think we have to figure out how to address racism in these categories, as well as kind of, on the day-to-day surface of what we experience. And I could say a lot more, but I'll stop there.
George, you had your hand up, but I don't see it up at the moment.
Pardon?
No, I was covered.
Okay, good. Just a side note to Doyle, please send me your email address. I've sent you something in the chat because you're new to the class and I don't have your email address.
Well, I'm related to Beverly Baxter.
Okay, that's fine. Good relation. But if you want an announcement, please send me. Please send me.
Yes, I'll send you a link.
Okay, and we had one last question and it was in the chat and it's from Ginny and Randy. And the question is, what were the white areas? And I think
On your map of redlining, the red areas, the green, the blue, the yellow.
Oh, I guess they weren't assessed for whatever reason. I don't know. They probably, or maybe they were not heavily residential. And so it wasn't necessary to have a color for like a commercial area. That's what I'm guessing.
Yeah, thank you. I think we figured it might be that. That was a while ago.
Well, I want to thank everyone for being here today. We ran a little,
Thank you.
started a little late, which was due to technical difficulties on my computer and other places. Next week, the topic is mass incarceration and the war on drugs. It's session 4, and it will be again at hopefully 4 o'clock. We'll try to get started on time. And in the meantime, if you want to review the any of the sessions, I did push the record button, so we should get this one recorded. And you will have the opportunity to look back at either lesson 1, 2, or 3 when I send out the reminder notice later this week. So thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you next week, and have a good week and have a safe week.
Bob,
Thank you.
is it okay to share the recordings with
Absolutely.
friends and family?
Share
Okay.
them with anybody you choose.
Please do. Please do.
The more
Thank
people that know this stuff, the better we're all gonna be.
Stuff.
Thank you.
Thanks, stuff.
And
Thank
and
you all.
if anybody wants to invite someone to join us, just have them send me an email.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Bob and Sue.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
See you
everyone.
next week.
Thank you.
Great.
Bye-bye. Hi, Ann.